You are about to experience Jackson Snyder Presents. Direct from the Vero Essin Yahad, a Hebrew Nation radio original program. JSP is a variety show seeking out Jewish and Christian origins, religion, theology, and history, and doing so in a fashion that is both educational and entertaining. Welcome to Jackson Snyder Presents.
Have you ever heard of the Codex Sinaiticus New Testament? I'm going to tell you about it today, and I'm going to offer you a free PDF of the Codex Sinaiticus. All you have to do is listen to this presentation, then go to www.yahad.me, send me a note, and I'll send it right back to you. Several years ago, a couple of acquaintances and I got a hold of a Codex Sinaiticus English translation. At that time, it was extremely difficult to find, and it still is now. And we typeset it and edited it, and it took us 5 years. But we have it now. The printed book is 600 plus pages, and it costs $45. But I'm going to give you one free if you want one. Just ring me up after you've listened to this presentation on the Sinaiticus at www.yahad.me. Put a note in there if that's what you would like, or just say the old Bible. And as quick as you can say jackrabbit, you'll find it in your email box. I seldom give this one away because I seldom find people that know anything about its value. But if you listen to the rest of this presentation, you're going to know all about it. So why is the Sinaiticus significant? Well, it was written about the middle of the 4th century AD. It's arguably the earliest extant Christian Bible. I don't think it's arguably anymore. It's a fact. It contains the earliest complete copy of the New Testament. Only one other nearly complete manuscript of the Christian Bible, that is the Codex Vaticanus, is of a similarly early date. The only Christian manuscripts of Scripture that are definitely of an earlier date contain relatively small portions of the text. Did you hear that? The Sinaiticus was copied before Constantine and the Council of Nicaea in 325. So what you're going to find in an English version, it's going to be a little bit different. And some of those passages that you read in the New Testament that you thought, oh, somebody must have put that in here, you're going to find that somebody did put them in there, usually scribes. Yet its great significance comes from three principal aspects: its role as a text, as canon, and book. Codex Sinaiticus represents one of the most important witnesses to the Greek text of the Septuagint and the New Testament. It's customarily given primacy of position in the lists of surviving manuscripts consulted for establishing the oldest text of these two traditions, that is the New Testament and the Septuagint, and is usually represented as the letter Aleph, sometimes O1, sometimes S for the New Testament. The Codex Sinaiticus is relevant not only for the history of the text of the Septuagint in the New Testament, but also for the history of many layers of later revisions to the text made by generations of correctors. These range in date from those made by the original scribes of the Codex in the 4th century to those made by much later correctors in the 12th century. And when you buy a King James Version, you're getting a version of the Bible that was put together in 1550 AD. You're going to see differences in the 1200 years between the two recensions. And sometimes there's just alteration of one letter to the insertion of whole sentences. And many of these are sentences that have turned into doctrines in the church. No other early manuscript of the Christian Bible has been so extensively corrected. A better understanding of the base text of the Codex alongside its subsequent corrections will provide us with a unique insight in the history of transmission of Greek biblical texts. By the middle of the 4th century, there was wide, yet neither complete nor universal agreement over the books to be considered as authoritative for Christian communities. There was no canon. The Codex Sinaiticus, being one of the earliest intact collections of such books is essential for an understanding of the contents and the arrangement of the biblical canon, as well as the uses made of it. The Greek Septuagint in the Codex comprises books not included in the Hebrew Bible and regarded in the Protestant tradition as apocryphal, like 2nd Esdras, Tobit, Judith, 1 through 4 Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, and Sirach. Appended at the end of the New Testament in the Codex are the apocryphal epistle of Barnabas, the shepherd of Hermas, and there's also space there for the Didache, those three being the earliest complete New Testament, comprised of 30 books, not just 27. Within the New Testament, the letter to the Hebrews is placed after Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians, and the Acts of the Apostles between the pastoral and Catholic epistles. All these facts have to be considered carefully when reconstructing the history of the canonization of Christian books. This process of canonization has also influenced and been influenced by the medium in which it, that is the Codex, has been transcribed and transmitted. From our earliest evidence onward, and in contrast to earlier and most contemporaneous practices, Christians preferred the format of the codex over the roll or the scroll. For a codex is very similar to our modern books. You'd have two covers with the text inside and a means by which it could be opened and read. And it was far cheaper than a scroll, and much smaller, pocket size. That's the codex, plural codices. From the 4th century onward, parchment was increasingly used instead of papyrus, which had previously been the predominant choice for sacred texts. The quality of Codex Sinaiticus's parchment and the advanced binding structure that would have been needed to support and contain within one volume over 730 large format leaves make the Codex Sinaiticus one of the most outstanding examples of book manufacture in its time. Careful planning, skillful writing, and editorial control needed for such an ambitious project gives us an invaluable insight into professional Christian book production that would exert its influence for many centuries afterward. One question that comes up is, who really owns the Sinaiticus? It's got a pretty incredible story. It's one of the big three, not Ford, GM, or Chrysler, but Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus, 4th or 5th century codices of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, that include the New Testament as well. Vaticanus is at the Vatican. Alexandrinus is at the British Library, and Sinaiticus is, well, it's in 4 different places, and upon this hangs my tale, T-A-L-E. Each venue of the Sinaiticus maintains that it owns the part that resides there. The major part is at the British Library in London. A lesser part is at the University Library of Leipzig. Few fragments are in St. Petersburg at the Russian National Library. Finally, the monks of St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, where it all originated, have discovered a few more leaves. The monks there would like it all back. And even today, so many centuries later, they feel like it was stolen from St. Catherine's, way up on Mount Sinai, outside of Jerusalem. The principal actor in this drama is a German scholar named Konstantin von Tischendorf of the University of Leipzig, who was the world's leading New Testament textual critic in the mid-19th century. At that time, biblical textual criticism was in its infancy and concentrated chiefly on resolving variants in different old biblical manuscripts in the hope of finding the most nearly original, the text closest to the supposed autograph. In 1840, Tischendorf published his acclaimed critical edition of the New Testament. He soon concluded, however, that it was deficient because the most important manuscripts were probably still unknown. At least to him, he decided to devote himself to locating other ancient manuscripts on which to base his study. This would take travel and money. The theological faculty of the University of Leipzig gave him a letter of recommendation to the government of Saxony. You see, Germany wouldn't be a national entity until the 1870s, which awarded him a grant of $100 to get him started. With this, he proceeded to Paris to explore its libraries for ancient biblical manuscripts. It was the beginning of a journey that would take 5 years and cost 5,000 thalers. Don't ask me what a thaler is. I can't remember. He soon received additional financial support from King Frederick Augustus II of Saxony, as well as from people he called patrons of learning throughout Europe. From Paris, he proceeded to Holland, Switzerland, England, and finally Italy, where in 1843 he was received by Pope Gregory XVI. In Italy, he also searched the libraries of Florence, Venice, Modena, Milan, Verona, and Turin. But even this wasn't enough for Tischendorf. In 1844, he decided to push on to Egypt, where he developed a special interest in the Coptic monasteries of the Libyan desert. Ultimately, he traveled to Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth. Then, before returning home in 1845, he worked his way through Anatolia, which we call Turkey today. Before leaving Egypt, he also visited St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. There he discovered what he called the pearl of my research. Tischendorf himself has described the occasion in these words. In visiting the library of the monastery in the month of May 1844, I perceived in the middle of the great hall a large and wide basket full of old parchment. The librarian, who was well informed, told me that 2 heaps of papers like this, moldered by time, had already been committed to the flame. To my surprise, I found amid this heap of papers a considerable number of sheets of a copy of the Old Testament in Greek, which seemed to me to be one of the most ancient that I had ever seen. The authorities of the monastery allowed me to possess myself of a third of these parchments, or about 43 sheets, all the more readily as they were destined for the fire. But I couldn't get them to yield up possession of the remainder. And look, he discovered this in the fire bucket. Why couldn't he get the other 85 or so sheets? Tischendorf supposed that it was because he appeared to be too anxious. This eagerness, and I quote, aroused in the monks their suspicions as to the value of this manuscript, unquote. On his return home, Tischendorf presented the 43 leaves to the government, designated them the Codex Friderico Augustinus, and deposited them in the library of his university in Leipzig to join the other manuscripts that already made up the Tischendorf collection. And so they have remained to this day. Tischendorf, of course, he wanted the other 2/3 as well. Through a friend, he approached the Viceroy of Egypt. The friend reported back that his efforts were unavailing. He says, the monks of the monastery have, since your departure, learned the value of these sheets of parchment and will not part with them for any price. In 1853, Tischendorf returned to the monastery but was unable to locate the sheets he had earlier seen and had been forced to leave behind. His only recovery was a fragment of 11 short lines from Genesis that came from the original codex. He brought this back with his appetite whetted. Then in 1856, Tischendorf decided to approach the Russian government, whose emperor was, after all, the head of the Orthodox Church. Tischendorf reports that his proposal to return to the monastery under the auspices of the Russian government initially met with some opposition in St. Petersburg. After all, he was a Protestant and not Russian. But finally, he reports, the good cause triumphed. The government even agreed to provide financial support for his travels. So in January of 1859, he set sail for the East under the auspices of Tsar Alexander II. With the support of such a patron, Tischendorf was warmly received at the monastery, but he was unable to find any biblical manuscripts that had any interest for him. He instructed his camel drivers to prepare to leave for Cairo. Then he took a walk with the monastery steward, the oikonomos, outside the walls. What followed belongs to Tischendorf, as he continues his story. We returned toward sunset. He begged me to take some refreshment with him in his cell. Scarcely had he entered the room when, resuming our former subject of conversation, he said, "And I, too, have read a Septuagint." So saying, he took down from the corner of the room a bulky kind of volume, wrapped up in red cloth, and laid it before me. I unrolled the cover and discovered, to my great surprise, not only those very fragments which 15 years before I had taken out of the basket, but also other parts of the Old Testament, the New Testament complete, and in addition, the Epistle of Barnabas and a part of the Shepherd of Hermas. Full of joy, which this time I had the self-command to conceal from the steward and the rest of the community, I asked, as if in a careless way, for permission to take the manuscript into my sleeping chamber to look over it more at leisure. There by myself I could give way to the transport of joy I felt. I knew that I held in my hand the most precious biblical treasure in existence, a document whose age and importance exceeded that of all the manuscripts that I had ever examined during 20 years' study of the subject. Once again, however, the question was how to pry the monks from their treasure. His first move was to ask the steward to allow him to take the manuscript to Cairo, to have it copied. For this, he was told, he would need the permission of the prior, or the dikaios, who is responsible for the monastery in the archbishop's absence. And alas, the prior had just departed for Cairo on his way to Constantinople. When he heard this, Tischendorf immediately left for Cairo in hopes of getting there to talk to the prior before he left for Constantinople. Tischendorf arrived in time and convinced the prior of his mission. Prior sent word back to the monks at the monastery to have the manuscript brought to Cairo. And again, Tischendorf had the treasure in his hand. While the manuscript was in Cairo, Tischendorf made a proposal to the monks that reveals his early thinking about how he would obtain the manuscript permanently by means of a gift to the Tsar. To continue in his story, the relation in which I stood to the monastery gave me the opportunity of suggesting to the monks the thought of presenting the original to the Emperor of Russia as the natural protector of the Greek Orthodox faith. The proposal was favorably entertained, but an unexpected obstacle arose to prevent its being acted upon. Now, as usual, the unexpected obstacle involved church politics. The monks had just unanimously elected Kirill as the new archbishop of the monastery, but the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who ordinarily performed the ordinations, was fiercely opposed to Kirill's election. The monastery sent a delegation of monks to Constantinople to plead their case, but the Sultan refused to see them. At this point, the new archbishop, still in Cairo, asked Tischendorf, in Tischendorf's words, to use my influence on behalf of the monastery. Tischendorf promptly left for Constantinople. What happened next is not entirely clear. The monks appealed to the other patriarchs, archbishops, and bishops, and ultimately were successful in having the archbishop's election by the monks confirmed. It seems clear, however, that Tischendorf took considerable credit for this outcome. Back to his story, I myself brought the news of our success back to Cairo, and with it I also brought my own special request that the Codex Sinaiticus be presented as a gift to the Tsar, backed with the support of Prince Lobanov, the Russian ambassador to the Sublime Porte. When Tischendorf returned to the monastery, the monks and the archbishop received him warmly, but they would agree only to lend him the manuscript to take to St. Petersburg, quote, to have it copied as accurately as possible. Thus were 347 folios delivered to the Russian capital, including the complete New Testament, plus sheets of the Old Testament, and several books of the Apocrypha. What a story. These were presented to the Tsar in November 1859. It's not quite clear what it meant to be presented, but at that presentation, Tischendorf made no mention of the manuscripts being a gift. On the contrary, he apparently stated that the community of Sinai had the right to ask for the manuscript's return. That the Russian government understood that Tischendorf was not making a gift is clear from the fact that the manuscript was retained in the files of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, pending, in the words of the British Library, which ultimately obtained them, ratification of the presentation. Only in 1869, when a somewhat mysterious ratification of the gift was executed, was the manuscript removed from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and placed in the Imperial Public Library of St. Petersburg. Since then, much has been written about whether the monastery gave Tischendorf the manuscript to give to the Tsar or had only lent it to him for copying. I read a whole book or two on this subject. There was a lot of collusion going on, a lot of confusion, and a lot of deceit. In 1960, Ihor Sevchenko, then a professor at Columbia University, visited Mount Sinai and learned that a monk named Nicephorus claimed to have a receipt signed by Tischendorf at the time he received the manuscript in 1859. 2 days later, Nicephorus produced the receipt in Tischendorf's own handwriting. 100 years later, it read as follows, originally in Greek, translation by Sevchenko. I, the undersigned, Constantine van Tischendorf, now on mission to the Levant upon the command of Alexander, autocrat of all the Russias, attest by these presents that the Holy Confraternity of Mount Sinai, in accordance with the letter of His Excellency Ambassador Lobanov, has delivered to me as a loan an ancient manuscript of both testaments, being the property of the foresaid monastery and containing 346 folia and a small fragment. These I shall take with me to St. Petersburg in order that I may collate the copy previously made by me with the original at the time of publication of the manuscript. The manuscript has been entrusted to me under the conditions stipulated in the aforementioned letter of Mr. Lobanov, dated September 10th, 1859, number 510. This manuscript I promise to return, undamaged and in good state of preservation, to the Holy Confraternity of Sinai at its earliest request. Signed, Constantine van Tischendorf, Cairo, September 16th, 1859. Now the author goes on to say, I myself recall seeing an English copy of this letter in a small black frame under glass on my first visit to the monastery in early 1973. I am told that it is still there. It was there when I went. I went up to St. Catherine's Monastery once, way up on the mountain. It was hot, but it was cool. By the way, it used to be that the only way you could get up there was in a basket, and this is way up there. As late as January 21st, 1864, Tischendorf wrote to Kirill, the monastery's archbishop, pleading to him, do not delay the donation of Sinaiticus any longer. The obvious implication is that no gift had yet been made. Continued efforts by Tischendorf to obtain an admission from Archbishop Kirill that a gift had been made were unsuccessful, as were efforts to have Kirill make a gift. It was left to Kirill's successor, Archbishop Kallistratus, to provide the Russian authorities with a confirmatory deed of gift. This was done only in 1869, 10 years after Tischendorf had taken the manuscript from the monastery. Although the deed of the gift has often been referred to since then and even quoted in existing documents, it has yet to be published. Sevchenko says that his investigation indicates that the deed of gift was obtained, and I quote, by the use of pressures that deserve closer scrutiny, unquote. Kallistratus himself expressed bitter complaints that the manuscript had been purloined, that is, secret or hidden, from the monastery. In the words of the Russian diplomat who negotiated the donation, he wanted to put, I quote, an end to the story of the Sinai Bible that has been stolen by us. After the Russian Revolution, St. Petersburg became Leningrad, and the library housing the Codex Sinaiticus became part of the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, the Soviet government was desperately in need of hard currency and began selling off art and rare books from the nationalized museums. Government would have to be desperate for that to happen. In 1931, a prominent London bookseller named Ernest Maggs traveled to the Soviet Union with a colleague, Maurice Eddinghausen, who was both a bookseller and a scholar. There they hoped to acquire some rare books. When they saw the priceless Codex Sinaiticus, Eddinghausen remarked to his hosts, If you ever want to sell it, let me know. Sometime later, Maggs received a postcard saying that the Soviet government would be prepared to sell the Codex Sinaiticus for £200,000. The British group countered with £40,000. Finally, a price of £100,000 was agreed upon. This was the largest price that had ever been paid for a book. It was an enormous sum at the time. The British government agreed to pay half the amount and guaranteed the remainder if it were not raised by public subscription. The public appeal was orchestrated by Sir Frederick Kenyon, the father of Kathleen Kenyon, who would become a famous archaeologist and the excavator of Jericho and Jerusalem. The Prime Minister of Britain at the time, Ramsay MacDonald, desired, by the public subscription, to associate the whole nation with the project. As Scott McKendrick, the head of the British Library's Western Manuscripts Division, recently told me, he wanted to involve the national government and the whole nation in saving the Codex Sinaiticus from the Soviet scourge. The Codex Sinaiticus arrived in London in December of 1933. It was a huge event, McKendrick went on. It was installed in the front hall of the British Museum. Over 5,000 people queued up to see it. And you see, a box was placed next to the exhibit where people could drop in coins. Thousands of British children contributed their pennies. What a story. Ultimately, the public subscription raised more than half the cost of the manuscript. The government was required to pay only £41,440. Still, there were dissenting voices in Parliament. Monstrous, cried Labourite John Joseph Tyner. I have seen this thing in the British Museum and call it useless. If scholars like these things, let them buy them and leave this £40,000 to be spent for the relief of poverty and distress. James Maxton, another member of Parliament and a supporter of Ramsay MacDonald, replied, would the Labour Party allow St. Paul's to collapse or sell the pictures in the National Gallery merely because, until now, the majority may not see anything in them? The government must have a sense of proportion. There are many things in this country of which the vast majority of voters are unappreciative. Is the government not to have the right to have the courage to say, this is a thing that England ought to possess? Unquote. The 347 leaves are still the highlight of the exhibit at the British Library, where they now reside. The 11-line fragment of Genesis that Tischendorf obtained on his second visit to the monastery, and a mutilated fragment of the last leaf of the Codex remains in St. Petersburg, and the full name of the Codex remains Codex Sinaiticus Petropolitanus. Petropolitanus, that's Petersburg, St. Petersburg. On May 26, 1975, during repairs to the monastery, workmen demolished a wall and unexpectedly came upon a small room containing chests with manuscripts of great importance. Among the manuscripts were pages thought to be missing leaves from the Codex Sinaiticus. In August 1977, Savas Agorides, professor at the Theological School of the Panepistemian Athenon, visited the monastery and was given access to these newly discovered leaves. He later reported to James H. Charlesworth, who I've talked about a lot in these essays, now a Princeton Theological Seminary, about his experience. He was almost overcome with excitement. He told Charlesworth, I was trembling, and time was too short for reading it. To my surprise, I think that I was holding 4 pages of Genesis from the Codex Sinaiticus. Father Sophronius was very generous. For more than 5 minutes, he allowed me to hold and read the lines from it. Charlesworth wrote a report in an American scholarly journal, apparently incensed at Charlesworth's unauthorized public disclosure. The monastery turned inward, and no further word would come from Mount Sinai. Charlesworth visited the monastery in 1979 in an attempt to heal the breach. The archbishop wouldn't even see him. In a report on this trip, Charlesworth asked, have the monks hid them again? In a 1980 article, Charles Worth laments that apparently the archbishop of the monastery conceals them. However, with a new project initiated in 2005, all that is about to change. I so well remember what was happening at that time. About the same time I published my English version of the Codex Sinaiticus, the British Museum did something. I guess we'll learn about it now. Originally, the Codex Sinaiticus contained approximately 730 folios, of which a little more than 400 have been recovered. Of these, 347 leaves, or to be precise, 346.5 leaves, half of the last one's missing, are in the British Library. 43 are in the University Library of Leipzig. Fragments of 5 leaves are in the Russian National Library in St. Petersburg, and 11 leaves and 14 fragments are in St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai. There's no question that the entire Codex Sinaiticus came from St. Catherine's, although scholars are also clear that conditions were not such in the mid-4th century that it could have been produced there. In the words of Philip Meyerson, a leading scholar on this issue, life itself for the Sinai solitaries was a struggle to provide the means for keeping body and soul together and to survive the periodic attacks of marauding Bedouins. The Codex Sinaiticus, like so many of St. Catherine's fabulous icons, was produced elsewhere sometime in the Byzantine period and was later brought to the monastery. When and from where we cannot know for sure. Meyerson suggests that the most likely origin was Caesarea Maritima, which reached its apogee in the Byzantine period. Some have speculated that the Codex Sinaiticus may even be one of the 50 Bibles the Emperor Constantine commissioned Eusebius, the church historian and bishop of Caesarea, to prepare after making Christianity a legal religion in the Roman Empire. That would be amazing. And that's what I think. I think it's one of those 50 copies. I recently asked the monastery's librarian, Father Justin Sinaites, Father Justin Sinaites, if the monastery still wanted the Codex Sinaiticus back. Idealistically speaking, of course, because it's one of the great treasures. However, we've agreed to set aside our differences in order to pursue this collaboration. He was referring to an unusual project initiated in June 2005 by the 4 venues with leaves from the Codex Sinaiticus to digitalize and conserve the manuscript, as well as to make it more accessible to scholars and the public. At first, the Archbishop of the monastery, Archbishop Damianos, didn't want anything to do with the project, in the words of Father Justin, but then people who knew about the project and knew the Archbishop presented the case that this is an extremely important project, and in spite of our differences, it was worth considering. The Archbishop then agreed to meet in Athens with the representatives of the British Library. There, the Archbishop insisted that the project must include a study of the recent history of the Codex, recent being since Tischendorf, how it was taken from the monastery, and what happened to it since. And this was agreed. Scott McKendrick, who's the point man at the British Library for the project, attended the Athens meeting and described it to me as a very honest and constructive meeting that resulted in an agreement in principles. We would face up to the facts of the modern history. The significance of the Codex, however, is sufficient to make parties who have had disagreements in the past work together. We've all gone into this to face up to what the facts of the case are. Father Justin explained how this investigation of the recent history will proceed. Each institution is responsible for collecting the archives on the recent history. Then the agreement is that scholars approved by the 4 institutions will investigate all of this and then draft a recent history that would itself be approved by all 4 participating institutions. I think that it's going to be enormously difficult. We might even find that it's impossible. But that's the goal that we've set ourselves. It should go far towards solving the antagonism that has existed in the past. And the author ends up with a question. Will the Codex Sinaiticus find rest at last? Now, this was written in August of 2015. and I haven't been updated on it, although now you can go out to the British Museum and look at the actual Codex Sinaiticus, that is, images of it. There are magnifying glasses in your computer there that you can look closely at each letter, and some of these books have been retranslated in a literal fashion. It just so happens, just before this all came about, just before the British Museum put this online, I put up my English translation of the Codex Sinaiticus, and I own the URL Sinaiticus.com. I should have got the whole thing, CodexSinaiticus.com, but I still own Sinaiticus.com because they wanted it, but I wanted it more. Let me see if I can find a link briefly to this. Codex Sinaiticus. How do you spell that? Online. It's really a marvelous little site. And here it is. What they got was CodexSinaiticus.org. Now, I bought Sinaiticus.org and Sinaiticus.com. And that is at www.CodexSinaiticus.org. Now, I hope that you are intrigued enough to maybe want to look into this version yourself. And honestly, there are only 2 people that own English versions of this New Testament. I'm one of them. There's another person that owns another English translation. And it's not hard to see the many differences, especially if you look at 1 John 5, the text that supposedly proves the Trinity, not in there. The references on burning up in hell, not in there. They were added later by some folks with an agenda. But I don't think we're done seeing things, especially texts, manuscripts popping up from the ground. I'm just waiting for the next big one, because that is my quest and my goal, to follow the star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far, the fight for the right. And then I can't remember the rest. Now, if you want a copy, let me know. You've got to write me at my URL, yahad.me. There's a form there. Just put your name in there. Send that you want the Sinaiticus or the Old Bible, and I'll send you one right over. And some other goodies, too. And you can look at it when you feel like it, or you can sell it to your friends. Yahad.me. Hope you enjoyed this little story. I certainly did. You have been listening to Jackson Snyder Presents on Hebrew Nation Radio.